cold had a way of stripping the noise from a man's head, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the soft, insistent crunch of snow beneath his horse's hooves. It was a late winter in the Arizona Territory, a season that had overstayed its welcome, blanketing the prairie in a silent, unforgiving white. My name is Colton Ha, and at 42, I'd learned to move through this world with the economy of a man who'd stopped chasing things a long time ago. My destination that morning was just a small trading post I knew of, a place with a pot of coffee perpetually on the stove, and a man who still accepted payment in hides. I'd been a lawman once. I'd worn a badge, believed in a clear line between right and wrong. But a gunfight, one I'd won in the end, had taken my wife and our boy. Since then, my work had been simple odd jobs, fence mending, stock work. I kept to myself away from trouble, believing that if I gave it a wide berth, it would return the favor. But trouble, I'd learned, was a ghost that didn't respect boundaries. From a rocky, snow-dusted rise, I saw it before I even knew what I was looking at. About 30 yards down, the new railroad tracks sliced a dark straight line through the frozen prairie. And on the rails, where the iron was slick with a thin layer of ice, lay a woman. She was barefoot, her arms and legs pulled tight with coarse hemp rope, and her head was turned slightly toward the slate-gray sky. Her dress, a traditional Comanche deerskin, was torn and frayed. Dust and grime streaked her skin and hair, and her wrists were rubbed raw, a testament to her struggle. A cold fist squeezed my gut. I'd seen this kind of cruelty before. Men using the vast empty territory as a shield to do whatever they pleased. The cold, the distance from any semblance of law, and the company they kept made them braver than they had a right to be. Near the woman, 3 men lounged beside a fire, the smoke a lazy plume against the white landscape. I pegged them as railroad workers, the cut of their shirts, their heavy boots. A whiskey bottle moved from hand to hand, and their rifles leaned against a pile of stacked timber like forgotten tools. One of them, a man with a thick, unkempt beard, was idly tossing stones toward the bound woman, a grotesque grin on his face when they landed close enough to make her flinch. I stayed perfectly still in the saddle, the biting wind whipping at my coat. The weight of the decision pressed in on me, heavy and unforgiving. I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from a life lived on the knife's edge, that if I stepped in, there would be no walking it back. 3 armed men, likely drunk and mean, and a woman caught in the middle. The smart thing to do was to ride on, to pretend I hadn't seen it. That was what a man with no stake in the fight might do. It was what a man who had already lost everything should do. But that part of me, the part that used to answer to a badge, the part that had seen too many lives end because someone looked away, wouldn't let it go. My heart, a lump of cold stone for so long, felt a flicker of heat. I thought of my wife's gentle hands, our boy's laugh, and I knew I couldn't ride on. Not this time. Swinging a leg over the saddle, I slid down, leaving the reins loose so my horse would stay put. The revolver on my hip felt heavier than usual, its cold metal a familiar weight. I moved down the slope, slow and steady, my boots making careful prints in the snow, using the scattered frozen scrub for cover. The men didn't notice me at first. They were talking loud, their words slurred by the cold, and the whiskey, their focus fixed on their cruel entertainment. By the time one of them spotted movement, I was close enough for my voice to carry. "That's far enough," I said, my tone flat, a piece of worn granite in the quiet air. They turned the motion clumsy and slow. The one with the beard reached toward his rifle. My thumb rested lightly on the hammer of my Colt, the barrel steady. "Leave it where it is," I said. The 2 sitting stayed put, eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and menace. The one standing froze his hand halfway to his weapon, his gaze flicking between the gun in my hand and the quiet certainty in my face. I kept my eyes on them as I moved toward the woman. Kneeling beside her, I pulled my knife from its sheath. The rope was dry and stiff, its fibers brittle from the cold and strain. It took only 3 quick cuts to free her ankles and wrists. She rolled off the rail, the frozen gravel and iron scraping against her raw skin. I gripped her shoulder to keep her upright. I could feel the tension in her muscles taut, ready to move but uncertain where to go. And then the sound came. A distant train horn, a mournful wail on the cold wind. A low rumble of wheels on the track building fast. The ground began to vibrate, the feeling reaching through the knees of my trousers and into my very bones. "Up," I said quietly, my voice urgent. I guided her toward the shallow, snow-covered ditch beside the tracks, keeping myself between her and the 3 men. We dropped into the dry, frozen weeds just as the first car roared past. The air shook with the force of it, the iron wheels screaming, grit whipping against our faces. When the last car was gone, the silence that remained felt heavier than the noise had been. I stood and offered her my hand. She took at her grip, small but firm despite the raw skin around her wrists. Her voice when it came was steady and low, not a hint of pleading in it. "Please save me from them. I'll be your wife. I'll do whatever you want." There was no desperation in her tone, only the plain, stark truth of someone with no other options. The plea was a contract, an offer of a life for a life. I didn't answer. I lifted her into the saddle mounted behind her and turned the horse toward open ground away from the railroad. The men shouted something after us, but their words were swallowed by the cold wind and the vastness of the prairie. The ride from the tracks to my homestead took over an hour, the low winter sun casting long, pale shadows. I kept the horse at a steady pace, mindful of her balance in the saddle. She sat rigid in front of me, her hands resting lightly on the horn, not looking back once. I could feel her tension, the way her shoulders stayed locked and her breathing remained shallow. But she didn't tremble, not even when we passed a scattering of frozen mesquite trees that might have hidden someone waiting. I figured she was maybe 24, 25. Strong-boned but thin from not eating enough for too long. The marks on her wrists and ankles weren't from just that day. They were older, darkened in spots, which meant she'd been tied before. The torn deerskin dress had been stepped on the fringe and beadwork broken in places. I didn't ask questions. There would be time later, and pushing her too soon might just close her up for good. The question of who she was and how she'd ended up there was already forming in my mind. But the answer could wait until we were somewhere the air didn't smell of stale whiskey and frozen earth. For now, the priority was getting her off open ground and to the safety of my cabin. When my homestead came into view, a small weathered log cabin, a lean to shed a corral with 2 horses and a mule, it looked almost out of place against the endless white. The place was quiet. No visitors, no neighbors for miles. That was why I'd chosen it years back. I swung down first, then helped her dismount. Her bare feet hit the snow-dusted ground and she flinched from the cold, shifting her weight. Without a word, I went to the shed and came back with a pair of old moccasins left by a trader months ago. I handed them over. She hesitated, then slipped them on, the gratitude in her eyes, a quiet thing but powerful. Inside the cabin smelled faintly of coffee grounds and the last stew I'd made 2 nights before. A table, 2 chairs, a small bed against the far wall, and an iron stove took up most of the space. I pointed toward the bed. "You can have that. I'll sleep by the fire." She didn't argue, but her eyes stayed on me as if weighing whether to believe the offer. I set a tin cup on the table, filled it from the water jug, and slid it toward her. She drank fast, then slower when she realized there was no rush. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with what hadn't been said. I broke it first. "Name." She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the cup in her hands. "Ayanna." It was the first real piece of her I had, and I gave mine in return. "Colton." I didn't press her about the men on the tracks or where she'd come from, but I knew others would wonder. Had she escaped from a work camp? Was she being hunted? Did she have family nearby? The way she'd looked at me after I cut her free said she didn't expect to go back anywhere she'd been. I set a pot on the stove, tipping in beans, a strip of salt pork, and the last of an onion I'd been saving. While it cooked, she sat at the edge of the bed, her eyes on me, tracking every move as if still deciding if I was dangerous. Her gaze didn't wander the room like someone curious. It was the intense, focused look of a person who had learned that every detail matters. When the food was ready, I ladled it into 2 bowls. She ate in silence, the spoon scraping the tin. Only after she'd finished did she seem to relax enough to let her shoulders drop. I saw her glance toward the door twice, checking that it was still shut. The night came quick. I unrolled a blanket near the fire and prepared for bed before snuffing the lamp. I spoke once more, not looking at her. "No one's going to come through that door unless I let them. You can sleep." She didn't answer, but when I lay back, I heard the faint creak of the bed as she settled in. I stayed awake a long while, listening for any sound outside, running through the possibilities in my mind. Would those men from the tracks come after her? Did she have enemies elsewhere? Did she even want to stay? For now she was here, and that was enough. But I knew the quiet wouldn't last forever. The snow-covered world outside was a cold blanket over a volatile fire. I was awake before the first light years of habit making it easy. My mind was clear, my movements quiet. The fire had burned low in the stove, leaving the cabin cool. I got up, fed in 2 small splits of wood, and set the coffee pot on the heat. Behind me, I heard the bed creak. Ayanna was sitting up, her hair loose over her shoulders, her eyes following me but not speaking yet. "Water's in the jug," I said, nodding toward the table. She rose slowly, the moccasins making no sound on the floor, and poured herself a cup. I noticed how she cradled it in both hands as if she wanted the warmth to seep into her very bones. I had work to do. The north fence had been leaning since the last windstorm, and with the snow and freezing temperatures, it needed to be fixed before the posts rotted through. I put on my hat and buckled my gun belt, then looked at her. "I'll be just outside," I said. "If anyone rides up, you stay inside. Keep the door barred." She gave a short nod, but I could see the question in her eyes. Would those men come back? I didn't say it out loud, but I was thinking the same thing. Out by the fence, I worked the post hole digger into the frozen ground, replacing one rotten post at a time. The sound of each shovel bite carried in the still cold air. Every so often I'd glance toward the cabin and see her at the doorway watching me. I guess she was weighing whether to trust me more than she already had. By midday I came back for water. Inside the cabin smelled faintly of boiled cornmeal. She'd found the flour in the pot and made a small batch without asking. I sat down and ate a few spoonfuls. "You know how to cook on that stove?" I asked. She gave a small shrug. "My mother, she taught me." Her voice was low and careful, but it was the first time she'd offered a piece of herself without being asked. I took that as a step forward. "You got family left?" I asked, my voice as gentle as I could make it. Her eyes held mine for a moment, then shifted away, a veil of sorrow dropping over them. "No one." That was all she said, but the way she said it, flat final, told me not to push. I noticed the way she moved around the room, memorizing where things were kept. The spare lamp oil under the bed, the tin of coffee in the cupboard, the rifle hanging on the wall. She wasn't just looking. She was learning the layout like someone who might need to defend herself. Later I brought in the shirt and trousers I'd meant to patch. She surprised me by taking them without a word, threading a needle and working the seam. Her stitches were neat and tight, quicker than mine ever were. When she handed them back, I nodded. "Good work." It wasn't much, but it made her glance at me with the faintest trace of satisfaction. As the day stretched toward evening, I kept thinking about something from the first night. The way she'd flinched when the wind rattled the cabin's loose shutter. It told me she'd been in places where noises meant danger. If the men from the tracks knew where I lived, they could come after dark, maybe when I wasn't ready. I decided I'd keep my rifle close at night until I was sure she was safe. That evening, we ate together at the table. No talk, just the sound of the stove and the scrape of tin spoons. When the last light faded, I checked the door twice, made sure the latch was set firm. She noticed. "You think they'll come?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't know," I answered honestly. "But if they do, they'll regret it." Her expression didn't change much, but her shoulders eased just enough for me to notice. I banked the fire low and stretched out on the blanket by the stove again, my Colt close at hand. She lay back on the bed, her eyes open for a long while before sleep found her. For now there were no riders in the distance, no sound beyond the soft night wind. But I knew that peace in this territory was something you only had until someone decided to take it away. The next 2 days passed in a quiet that was more tense than peaceful. I kept an eye on the horizon every morning and evening, scanning for dust trails that would now be puffs of snow kicked up by horses. On the third afternoon, just as the sun started, its slow drop, the kind of movement I'd been expecting, appeared. 3 riders coming from the east. Even at a distance, I recognized the slouch and loose seat of men who'd been drinking. Ayana was by the corral, tossing handfuls of hay to the mule. I stepped out onto the porch, my rifle already in my hand. Inside, I told her, my voice low and urgent. She froze, eyes tracking the riders, then went straight to the cabin without a word. The door closed, and I heard the bar drop into place. The 3 horses slowed as they reached my fence line. The men didn't bother dismounting at first, just sat there, staring like they were sizing me up. I kept my stance easy, but with the rifle held low and ready. "You got something that belongs to us," the one in front called out. His face was ruddy from the cold and liquor, the kind of man who thought volume could make up for reason. "Don't think so," I said, my voice staying calm, carrying across the yard without a shout. "She was with us," the man insisted, his tone turning ugly. "We want her back. That's the law." I took a slow step forward, the crunch of snow beneath my boots the only sound. "You tie a woman to rails, you lose your say in the matter." One of the others laughed a short and mean sound. "She's an Indian. Doesn't make her yours just 'cause you cut her loose." The front rider swung down his boots, hitting the frozen dirt. He had a revolver on his hip, his hand hanging just close enough to make a point. I shifted the rifle, the barrel lifting a half-inch. "You reach for it, you won't finish the draw," I said flatly. That brought a pause. The man's jaw worked, but his hand stayed where it was. Behind him, the second rider muttered something about not wanting trouble. The third, tall and narrow-faced, just spat into the snow and stared at the cabin door. Inside, I knew Ayana stood just behind the window watching. She could see my posture, the way I didn't flinch under their eyes. She felt the heat rise in her chest. Fear, yes, but also a sharp need to stand in the open instead of hiding. Without thinking, she unbarred the door and stepped onto the porch. The movement drew all eyes. She was still wearing the mended deerskin dress, her hair brushed but unbound. She stood straight, and her voice, though low, carried in the still air. "I'm not yours," she said, looking directly at the front rider. For a moment, no one spoke. The tall one sneered. "You'll change your mind when the law comes." My voice cut in sharp and final. "Law's a long ride from here, and you're looking at it for now. I'm telling you plain and simple, leave." The lead man's eyes shifted between us, calculating. Finally, he swung back onto his horse. "You'll regret it," he said, but there wasn't much strength in it now. They turned, riding off slow enough to let their words hang, but fast enough to be gone before the light failed completely. I watched until the dust and snow swallowed them, then lowered the rifle. Ayanna was still on the porch, her hands at her sides. I looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "They might try again," I said. "But next time I'll be ready before they're in sight." She nodded once. "So will I." It wasn't defiance in her voice. It was a statement of fact, and I knew she meant it. That night I kept the rifle closer to my bedroll, and she kept the bar set on the door even after I'd turned in. Both of us knew the matter wasn't finished. But now it was clear we'd face it side by side. The morning after the confrontation, I was outside before the sun broke the horizon, checking the ground for any fresh sign of horses. The yard held only my own tracks, but I didn't trust the quiet. Trouble didn't always announce itself in hoof prints. It had a way of slipping in when a man let himself believe it was gone. Ayanna stepped out onto the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She watched me circle the corral, leaning on a post when I came back. "They'll come again?" she asked. "Could be," I said. "Could be they'll wait for a better chance." She didn't look away from me. "What will you do?" "Same as yesterday, only faster." That seemed to settle it for now. She went inside, and when I followed, the smell of something cooking surprised me. She'd found the flour and lard making flatbread on the stove's iron plate. I realized it was the first time I'd smelled bread in this place since my wife's passing years ago. She slid a piece onto a tin plate and set it in front of me without a word. We ate quietly, but I was thinking ahead. If those men returned with more riders, the cabin alone wouldn't be enough cover. I decided to make small changes. Nothing obvious, but enough to tilt things in our favor. I spent the rest of the morning repairing the shutter so it wouldn't rattle in the wind, setting up a spare water barrel closer to the door, and clearing a line of sight to the east in case I needed to fire from the porch. Ayanna didn't just watch this time. She followed me into the shed, sorting through nails, handing me the hammer without being asked, even pulling a coil of rope from the rafters when I needed it. Her movements were deliberate, like she was learning more than just where things were. She was learning how to live here. By midday, we worked side by side, mending a section of the corral fence. I caught myself watching how she handled the tools, noting the quickness in her grip, the way she checked the post's steadiness after each strike. It wasn't the work of someone used to being idle. When we stopped to rest, I asked the thing that had been in the back of my mind since the day on the tracks. "Why were you with them?" Her eyes stayed on the fence line. "They took me from the camp where I was staying. Said they'd trade me for supplies in another town. I believed them at first. I shouldn't have." "Camp," I pressed gently. "Some of my mother's people. Not my whole family, what's left of it. We were moving north, but they left me." She didn't explain why, and I didn't push. The tone in her voice made it clear she'd already said more than she'd planned. As the sun lowered, we both kept glancing toward the horizon, half expecting riders. None came, but the unease was still there. That evening, while I sharpened my knife at the table, Ayanna sat sewing by lamplight, repairing another tear in her dress. The room was quiet except for the scrape of steel on stone and the soft pull of thread. When she finished, she folded the garment neatly and set it aside. "You keep fixing that dress," I said. "You'll run out of cloth." She gave the smallest hint of a smile. "I'll make it last. It's all I have." I thought about that for a long moment, then stood and pulled a folded wool blanket from the shelf. "This will do until we can get more," I said, setting it on the table. She touched it, testing the weight of it in her hands. We slept that night with the same unspoken agreement as before, me by the fire with my rifle close her behind the barred door of the bedroom. But the difference now was clear. She wasn't hiding from the fight anymore. She was ready to meet it with me if it came. The next morning the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of snow from somewhere far off. I was tightening the cinch on my saddle when I noticed Ayanna standing by the corner of the cabin, scanning the open land. She wasn't just looking. She was studying the distance the way a person does when they expect movement. "You see anything?" I asked. She shook her head, but her eyes stayed on the horizon. Number. Just don't like not knowing where they are. I understood. The uncertainty worked on a person's nerves more than the fight itself. We'll make a trip to town today, I said. Need flower shot, maybe some cloth for you. And I want folks to see you here with me. Harder for them to claim you belong to anyone else if half the town's seen otherwise. Ayana hesitated, then gave a slow nod. I could tell she was thinking about what stepping into town meant, exposing herself to strangers, some of whom might know the men from the tracks. We rode out mid-morning. The road was hard-packed from weeks of freezing temperatures. The sound of our horses' hooves carried in the still cold air. As we approached the cluster of buildings that passed for the nearest town, I felt the shift in her posture. She straightened in the saddle, eyes forward, jaw set. At the general store, I tied the horses and handed her down. We stepped inside, the air cooler but thick with the smell of lamp oil and dried goods. The storekeeper, a thin man with a bent posture, looked up from his ledger. His eyes lingered on Ayana for a fraction longer than they should have. "Morning, Colton," he said. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy," I replied, setting a list on the counter. "Need flour, coffee, lead shot, and a few yards of cloth." The man fetched the items, but I saw him glance at Ayana again, this time with something closer to curiosity than suspicion. She didn't lower her gaze. Instead, she looked right back at him, calm and steady, until he busied himself with weighing the flour. On the way out, I carried the sack and box, letting her walk ahead. I watched the way she moved through the street, not hurried, not timid. A few people turned to look, but no one spoke. That in itself was a small victory. Back at the homestead, Ayana helped me unload the supplies. She set the cloth aside without comment, but I noticed her running her fingers over it once before folding it neatly. Over supper, I finally asked the question that had been in my head since she'd told me about her mother's people. "When they left you," I began. My voice quiet. "Was it because of those men?" She looked at the fire for a long moment. "Partly. They didn't want to fight, they couldn't win. And some didn't want me there anymore. My father wasn't Comanche. They said I brought trouble." I felt a slow tightening in my chest. I knew what it was to be cast aside by your own. "That trouble's mine now," I said quietly. "They come back, they'll answer to me." Her eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time since we'd met, I saw something settled there. Not just gratitude, but a kind of trust that couldn't be forced. Later that night, when the wind picked up and rattled the loose edge of a shed roof, I rose to check it. When I came back, and Ayana had placed my rifle on the table within easy reach. She didn't say anything, and neither did I, but both of us knew exactly why she'd done it. The following day broke with a thin, cold light and a wind sharp enough to cut through the seams of my coat. I'd planned to mend the windmill before it got worse. Its tail had been catching in the gusts, making the blade spin unevenly. But the job wasn't one a man could put off without risking his water supply. Ayana was assorting the new cloth on the table when I stepped back inside to get my wrench. "You need help?" she asked. "Not for this," I said. "Wind's too strong up there. I'll be quick." She didn't argue, but her eyes followed me as I went back out. The windmill stood at the far edge of the yard, its ladder worn smooth from years of climbing. I checked the bolts, then started up. The metal frame swayed with the gusts, each step colder than the last. I was 3 rungs from the top when the wrench slipped from my gloved hand, clanging off the lower braces before hitting the ground. I cursed under my breath and leaned to grab the spare tied to my belt. That shift in weight was all it took. The old wood beneath my boot cracked and the rung gave way. I fell the last 8 feet, landing hard on my left side. The impact knocked the air out of me and a sharp pain tore through my shoulder. I lay still for a moment, teeth clenched, waiting for the wave of heat and dizziness to pass. Ayana was already running toward me, the bottom of her dress catching on the dry, frozen grass. She dropped to her knees beside me. "Can you move?" "Not well," I said, through gritted teeth. She helped me sit, her hands firm but careful. When I tried to stand, the shoulder screamed and my knees buckled. She half-guided, half-pulled me back toward the cabin. Once inside, she cleared the table with one sweep and made me sit. "Dislocated," she said after a quick look. "Needs to go back in." I raised an eyebrow. "You done that before?" "Twice. My uncle. You trust me?" I hesitated only a second. "Do it." She had me sit sideways, braced my arm against her hip, and with one smooth motion pushed and rolled. The joint slid back with a dull pop that made my stomach turn. I let out a sharp breath, but the pain eased almost immediately. She tied my arm in a makeshift sling using a strip from the new cloth. "You don't lift anything for a while," she said, her voice firm. For the rest of the day, she took over the chores without hesitation. feeding the stock, hauling water, even carrying the firewood inside. I hated being idle, but I watched the way she moved through each task with purpose, like she'd always been here. By evening, I couldn't ignore the question that had been there since the fall. "Why'd you run toward me out there?" I asked. "You could have just gone for help." She gave a small shrug. "Because you're the only one here. If something happens to you, I'm alone again." Her words were plain without sentiment, but they carried a weight I understood. For both of us, the other had become the only line between living and being left behind. That night, I kept the rifle within reach as usual. But for the first time since she'd come, I didn't hear the sound of her door bar sliding into place. Instead, her door stayed unlatched and the cabin felt smaller, warmer, even with the wind still battering the walls. The morning after my fall came with a heavy low sky that threatened rain but gave none. My shoulder ached with every movement, but I decided we couldn't wait any longer to make things official in town. The talk at the fence line would eventually reach the wrong ears, and if those men came back with some half-baked claim, I wanted no one to doubt where Ayanna stood. She didn't ask why when I told her to saddle both horses, but her eyes narrowed slightly in thought. I could see she understood this was more than a supply trip. The ride was slow. I kept my injured arm, still letting the reins hang in my good hand. Ayanna rode just ahead, scanning the horizon, as if she expected trouble to rise out of the snow. The closer we got to town, the straighter her back became. The county office was a squat wooden building on the far side of the main street. The deputy inside, a broad man with thinning hair, looked up from a ledger when we entered. Recognition flickered in his eyes, and I saw the man decide without saying it that this wasn't the kind of business he'd interfere with. "We're here for a marriage license," I said plainly. The deputy didn't blink. "Names." Ayanna spoke hers, clearly spelling it out so there'd be no mistake. I gave my own. The deputy filled the paper, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the room. "You sure about this?" the deputy asked, not looking up. "Yeah," I said. "And I want it noted we both came in, stood here, and agreed." The deputy nodded, once tore the paper from the pad and reached for a small box of brass rings on the counter. I picked a simple one paid cash, then turned to Ayanna. She was holding the carved mesquite ring she'd been working on in the evenings, the one I'd seen her shaping by lamplight. I slid the brass ring onto her finger. She placed the mesquite one on his. No speeches, no crowd. Just a look between us that said what neither had put into words before. When we stepped back onto the street, the cold air bit at our faces, but neither of us moved to hurry. We walked past the general store, past the saloon, and though a few people looked our way, no one spoke. That was enough. The ride home felt different. The silence between us wasn't the guarded kind from before. It was settled, like we had each put our weight on the same side of the scale and found it steady. Back at the cabin, I stabled the horses while Ayanna lit the stove. When I came inside, the smell of coffee filled the room. She set 2 cups on the table and sat across from me, leaning back just slightly in the chair. So she said, her tone even but her eyes sharp. "Now it's harder for them to take me." "Harder," I agreed. "Not impossible, but harder's a start." We drank in silence for a moment, the kind where both knew there was more to say, but also knew it didn't have to be said right away. That night, I left the rifle leaning by the wall instead of at arm's reach, and Ayanna didn't close her bedroom door at all. The air in the cabin felt different, still quiet, but no longer heavy with uncertainty. It wasn't the end of the trouble, I knew. But for the first time since the day on the tracks, I felt like we were standing on the same ground for good. Spring came in slow, the kind where each morning felt just a little warmer than the last. The ground softened, new shoots pushing up through the hard dirt along the south wall of the cabin. I had been keeping my eyes on the fence line more out of habit than worry. Weeks had passed without a sign of the 3 men from the tracks. Whether they decided the fight wasn't worth it or had found trouble elsewhere, I didn't care. The important thing was, they were gone. Ayanna had started planting beans and a small row of greens in the patch of soil I had turned for her. She worked in the early hours, the hem of her new cloth dress brushing the dirt, her moccasins leaving light prints in the tilled rows. I watched her from the porch one morning, my coffee cooling in my hand. She moved with the same quiet focus she had when she mended a torn seam or prepared food, steady, sure, with no wasted effort. Inside the cabin, the changes were small but clear. A second water barrel stood by the door. The shelf had been organized into a system only she seemed to know, but I found I didn't mind. The rifle was still close to the table, but it wasn't a constant shadow anymore. The place felt lived in, not just occupied. One afternoon, while repairing the corral gate together, I finally said what had been building in me since the day in the county office. "You could have left," I said, not looking up from the hinge I was tightening. "I didn't want to," she replied simply. I nodded, testing the gate's swing. "Not because of the paper. Because you wanted to. That's right. I turned to meet her eyes. There was no hesitation in them now. No guarded edge, no measuring of what I might do next. It was the same steady look she'd had the day she stepped out on the porch to face those men, only warmer. That night after supper, I said the Comanche words she'd taught me. One for water, one for fire, one for bread, one for sky. And then I added the last one she'd given me just the day before home. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that stayed in her eyes long after it left her mouth. When we turned in, she didn't go to the separate room. She stayed by the fire with me, both of us sitting in the low light saying little. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass in a slow wave, a song of peace instead of a harbinger of danger. The next morning, we saddled the horses together, not because we had to go anywhere urgent, but because the work was easier with two. I talked about adding another trough, maybe building a smokehouse before next winter. Ayana agreed, already thinking about what could be planted if we cleared more ground. By midday, the fence line was checked, the stock watered, and the cabin door left open to the mild spring air. For the first time in a long while, there was no feeling of waiting for the next blow to fall. We had what we needed, and what we'd chosen. And in this unforgiving territory that was more than most folks ever got, the trouble was behind us. The ground was steady under our feet, and the life ahead was ours to keep. The story reminds us that in life there will be moments when we must choose between personal safety and doing what is right. Even when the past has left us with loss and deep scars, standing up to protect what is just is how we keep our hearts from growing numb. Courage is not always found in grand acts, but in refusing to turn away when faced with injustice. Moreover, the relationship between Colton and Ayana shows that trust does not come from fine words, but from small, repeated actions that reflect respect and genuine care. This is especially meaningful for those who have been hurt. Patience and understanding are the true foundation of healing. Finally, the story affirms that even in later years, we can still find peace and new purpose if we open our hearts and are willing to walk alongside someone else. Sometimes sharing life's burdens not only helps the other person survive, it also saves us. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.